I was 9 years old the first time my mother told a room full of relatives that I'd torn up my cousin's report card out of jealousy. I hadn't. I'd found it ripped on the kitchen floor where her cat had been clawing at paper that morning, and I'd tried to tape it back together before anyone noticed. She looked at the tape marks in my hands and told everyone I was a vindictive little girl who couldn't stand anyone doing better than her. My grandfather laughed. Nobody asked me a single question. I was 9, and I understood something that took most adults decades to learn the hard way. The people who are supposed to protect your name are sometimes the ones who burn it down first, and they do it so calmly that nobody thinks to check the matches in their hands. I'm Camille Whitfield. I'm 31. I grew up outside Halifax in a house where my mother kept the thermostat at exactly 19 degrees year-round, because anything else was wasteful, and where my father measured affection in things he'd paid for, rather than things he'd said. I spent the next 22 years after that report card incident being careful about what I said at dinner, careful about which version of myself showed up at Christmas. I became the kind of adult who apologized for taking up space in a doorway, because somewhere along the way I'd absorbed the idea that my truth was negotiable depending on who was in the room and how convenient it was for them. Then I met Theo Marchetti. He was 34, a structural engineer who'd moved to Halifax from Montreal for a bridge retrofit project, and we met at a Canada Day barbecue thrown by a mutual friend on the Dartmouth side of the harbor. He showed up late, soaked from a sudden July downpour, holding a case of Moosehead like an offering, and the first thing he said to me was that he'd gotten lost trying to find parking and had walked the wrong way down Alderney for 15 minutes. He wasn't embarrassed about it. He just laughed at himself and asked if I'd save him a burger before they were gone. There was something in that, the ease of admitting he'd messed up without flinching, that I hadn't encountered much in my life. We talked until the fireworks started over the harbor, and by the time they ended, he had my number, and I had the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having been actually listened to. We dated for 16 months. He met my parents twice, both times leaving with a headache he was too polite to mention out loud, though I could see it behind his eyes. The careful, deliberate way my mother asked him about his salary at the dinner table. The way my father referred to his job as playing with rulers in front of him. Theo never said a bad word about them to me. He just got quieter in the car afterward, and once, driving home from Thanksgiving, he reached over and held my hand at a red light and said, "You know you don't have to keep earning a seat at that table, right?" I didn't have an answer for that. I just squeezed his hand back. He proposed in November at Point Pleasant Park, on one of those gray Atlantic afternoons where the wind comes straight off the harbor and cuts through every layer you're wearing. We'd been walking the trail near the old fortifications when he just stopped, pulled a ring out of his coat pocket with hands that were shaking from cold and nerves in equal measure, and said my name like it was the only word he knew. I said yes before my brain caught up with my mouth, and we stood there laughing in the wind for 10 straight minutes before either of us thought to get out of it. We picked a date for the following October, a Saturday wedding at a restored barn venue out past Wolfville, in the Annapolis Valley, surrounded by apple orchards that would be at their best that time of year. The rehearsal dinner was planned for the Friday night before, at a small farm-to-table restaurant in Wolfville proper, the kind of place with exposed beams and mismatched vintage chairs, and a chalkboard menu that changed with whatever had come in from the valley that week. I had been planning that dinner in my head for months. Who would sit where, what I'd wear, the toast Theo's best man kept threatening to make too long. My parents had never approved of Theo, not really. My mother, Diane, no, that's not. My mother's name was never going to matter the way her actions did. What mattered was that she'd spent 16 months finding small, surgical ways to suggest Theo wasn't quite enough. Not dramatic things, just comments. An engineer, that's stable, I suppose. Nothing flashy. He seems very settled for someone his age, doesn't he want more? Death by 1,000 polite paper cuts, delivered over good china. I had learned, the way I'd learned most things in that family, to let the comments slide off and keep moving forward. I thought I had built enough distance to survive the wedding season without a real incident. I was wrong. 12 days before the wedding, Theo called me on a Wednesday evening while I was still at the office, finishing up a grant proposal for the nonprofit I worked for. His voice had a flatness to it I'd never heard from him before. Not angry. Just stunned, like he was trying to process something too large to fit through a phone line. He told me my parents had shown up at his office in downtown Halifax that afternoon, unannounced, and asked the receptionist to pull him out of a client meeting. They told him, in the conference room, with the door closed, that I had a son, that I'd given birth at 23 and given the baby up without telling anyone, that I'd kept it hidden from everyone, including, apparently, the man I was about to marry. My father used the phrase "buried the truth," like he was quoting from a thriller novel. My mother told him, in a voice he described as almost gentle, that he deserved to know what kind of woman he was building a life with. I sat in my car in the parking garage under my office building, with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, and I felt something in my chest cave inward, slow and total, like a building coming down from the inside. Because there had been a pregnancy, there had been a hospital, there had never been a baby that lived to be given up to anyone. When I was 23, I was with a man named Adrian Petrov, an investment analyst 11 years older than me who I'd met through a mutual coworker. He was magnetic in that specific way that takes you a long time to recognize as control rather than confidence. When I got pregnant, he didn't yell. He was worse than that. He was calm, methodical, listing reasons why it was not the right timing for either of us, until I felt like a child being talked out of a tantrum rather than a grown woman making a decision about her own body. I told him I needed time. He told me time wasn't something he had patience for. I was 18 weeks along when I started bleeding on a Tuesday morning at the gym, and by that night I was in a recovery room at the IWK with my mother in the chair beside my bed, holding a cup of terrible vending machine coffee she never drank, telling me it happened for a reason. She knew. She had been there. She had signed the parking validation slip at the hospital with her own hand. And 12 days before my wedding, she sat across from the man I love and told him I'd abandoned a living child, because the truth, that her daughter had lost a pregnancy in circumstances that were nobody's fault, least of all mine, apparently wasn't a story that suited whatever narrative she needed Theo to believe about me. I drove straight to Theo's apartment that night, the one near the Halifax Common he still kept, even though we'd been talking about moving in together after the wedding, and I told him everything: the relationship with Adrian, the pregnancy, the miscarriage. The 18 months of silence I'd kept around all of it because some part of me had filed that chapter away as something too painful to reopen, even with him. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he reached across his kitchen table, the same cheap IKEA table he'd had since university, and took both my hands in his and said, "I'm sorry that happened to you, Cam. I'm sorry you carried that alone." Not a question about whether I was telling the truth, not a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Grief first, before anything else. That was the moment I understood, fully, what kind of partner I had actually found, and how different it was from everything I'd grown up believing love was supposed to cost. But knowing he believed me didn't undo what my parents had planted. A seed of doubt, dropped 12 days before a wedding, doesn't just dissolve because one good man chooses to be good. It sits there, low and quiet, waiting for a moment of stress or doubt to make itself useful again. I knew my parents understood this. I knew it was the entire point. What none of us could have predicted was who would walk into that restaurant in Wolfville on rehearsal night, and what she'd be carrying with her when she did. The dinner was supposed to be the soft exhale before the wedding itself. 22 of our closest people gathered in that converted barn restaurant, string lights strung along the exposed rafters, local cider, and Nova Scotia wine on every table, the smell of wood smoke drifting in from the patio. Theo stood near the bar in his gray blazer, laughing with his groomsmen, finding my eyes across the room every few minutes the way he always did. Like he was checking the world was still arranged correctly. For one stretch of maybe 20 minutes, standing in the doorway in the green dress I'd chosen specifically, because Theo once said the color reminded him of the valley in late summer, I let myself believe the last 12 days hadn't happened. My parents were seated near the head of the table. My father, Patrick, was on his second whiskey. My mother wore cream silk and the particular smile she reserved for events where she expected to be the one people complimented afterward. They had called me 4 times since the confrontation at Theo's office. I hadn't picked up once. They'd come to the dinner anyway, because I hadn't yet found the words, or maybe the courage, to formally uninvite them, and because some exhausted, hopeful part of me had wanted to believe they'd simply behave for one night and let me have this. That hope ended at 7:52 p.m., when the restaurant's front door opened and a woman walked in that I hadn't seen in almost 5 years. Her name was Imogen Castellano. She was 36, with sharp eyes and the kind of composed stillness that comes from having lived through something that reorganizes a person's nervous system permanently. She'd been my closest friend during the year I was with Adrian, the one who drove me to the IWK that Tuesday night, the one who sat with me in the waiting room while my mother went to find coffee, the one who never once made me feel like the miscarriage was a problem to be managed quietly. We drifted apart in the years after, not from any falling out, just the particular erosion that happens when two people are bonded by a memory neither of them wants to keep revisiting. I hadn't invited her. I hadn't told her the wedding was even happening. She walked past the hostess stand, past a dozen confused faces, straight toward me, holding a thick manila envelope against her chest like it might try to escape. She said my name once, quietly, and asked for 5 minutes before I said anything at all back to her. I pulled her into the small hallway by the restaurant's wine cellar, the noise of the dinner muffled behind the door, and she put the envelope in my hands and told me to open it right there. Inside were photocopies of my hospital discharge papers from the IWK, dated, stamped, official. A letter from the attending physician confirming a miscarriage at 18 weeks. And underneath those, printed screenshots of a text conversation between my mother and Adrian Petrov, the most recent one sent 11 weeks earlier. My mother had reached out to him directly, out of nowhere, and asked him to confirm, if anyone ever asked, that I'd given birth to a son and given him up for adoption without telling Adrian. She'd offered in the third message to make it worth his time if he backed up the story. Adrian, to his very limited credit, had told her flatly that wasn't what happened and that he wanted nothing to do with whatever she was building. She'd pushed twice more. He'd stopped answering after that. Imogen had gotten the screenshots because Adrian, unsettled by the exchange, had reached out to her. They'd stayed loosely in each other's orbit over the years through a mutual friend, and told her she should probably know what his old girlfriend's mother was trying to manufacture. Imogen had driven 4 hours up from where she now lived outside Moncton to put the envelope in my hands before I said any vows to anyone. I stood in that narrow hallway with the papers shaking slightly in my grip, and what moved through me wasn't rage, not at first. It was something colder and more settled than rage, the specific, almost peaceful sensation of finally holding proof of something you've always known in your body, but never had the language or the evidence to say out loud. My parents weren't simply difficult or old-fashioned or hard to please. They had sat down and calculated, with intention, how to manufacture a lie precise enough to detonate 12 days before my wedding, and they'd done it because some part of them needed control over the story of my life more than they needed me to actually have one. I walked back into the dinner. Theo read my face before I'd crossed half the room and was beside me before I had to ask. I set the envelope down on the table directly in front of my parents, in front of the cider glasses and the candle stubs and 22 people who'd come to celebrate something that had nothing to do with them. I didn't raise my voice. I'd spent 31 years being loud in rooms where nobody was listening, and I wasn't going to waste this particular silence I'd finally built for myself. I told them, evenly, what the papers said. I told the table what my parents had walked into Theo's office and said, word for word, as close as I could reconstruct it. My father's jaw tightened until I could see the muscle working under his skin. My mother looked at the tablecloth and said nothing, which was, for her, its own kind of confession. I asked them to leave the restaurant. After a long, ugly stretch of silence, they did. The room held its breath for a moment that felt like it stretched on far longer than it actually did. Then Theo's mother, Marisol, a woman who had been nothing but warm to me since the day we met, stood up first and began to clap. Slowly, and then the whole table joined her. And I stood there under the string lights with Theo's hand wrapped around mine and Imogen across the table with her eyes wet. And I let 22 years of being called a liar in rooms where nobody defended me finally, quietly, dissolve. We got married that Saturday in the orchard behind the barn, under a sky that couldn't decide between gray and gold, with about 40 people instead of the 80 we'd once planned for. My parents weren't there. I want to be honest and say there was a version of that morning where some small, exhausted part of me grieved their absence anyway. The way you grieve a house you grew up in, even after you've learned it was never safe. But mostly what I felt was relief, clean and uncomplicated, the kind I hadn't experienced since I was 9 years old, holding taped-together paper in my hands. Theo's voice cracked twice during his vows. I made it through mine before I let myself cry. Imogen sat in the front row in a borrowed dress and handed me a tissue at exactly the moment I needed it, the same way she always had. My parents have called 11 times since the wedding. I haven't answered once, and for the first time in my life, that silence doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like a door I finally learned how to close from the inside. I spent most of my 20s believing that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had simply gotten an inferior version of me, one that deserved less patience, less belief, less benefit of the doubt. I understand now that was never the truth. Some people don't stop trying to control your story because they've changed. They stop because you finally move far enough out of reach that their version of you no longer has anywhere left to land.